The janitor pointed at the portrait and said, "That's my wife." The billionaire's secret left everyone speechless. The office was the kind of place that made Marcus Webb feel invisible. Not in a cruel way, just in the quiet, expected way that cleaning staff tend to disappear into the background of powerful spaces. Marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago, leather chairs that probably cost more than his monthly rent, abstract paintings that nobody actually looked at. Everything in that building was designed to communicate one message to anyone who entered: "You have arrived." Marcus hadn't arrived anywhere. He was just the man with the mop. He'd been cleaning the 42nd floor of Hargrove Medical Group for 3 years. 3 years of late nights, of nodding at security guards, of learning which executives left their coffee cups on the edge of the desk and which ones, at least, had the decency to toss them in the trash. He knew this floor better than the people who worked here during the day. He knew which conference room had a flickering bulb that maintenance kept ignoring. He knew the CFO's assistant ate lunch at her desk every single day and always left crumbs near the keyboard. He knew every portrait in the executive hallway, or so he thought. Tonight was a Tuesday, on 47 p.m. The building was nearly empty, just Marcus, his cart, and the low hum of the ventilation system that never quite went away. He worked methodically the way he always did, room by room, spray, wipe, move on. There was a rhythm to this work that he'd learned to appreciate. It didn't demand anything from him emotionally. It just asked him to show up and be thorough. That was something Marcus Webb could do. He was almost finished with the hallway when he turned the final corner. The long stretch near the CEO's office, lined with framed portraits of board members, founders, and key executives. He'd walked this corridor hundreds of times easily. He could tell you the name on every frame without looking. But tonight something was different. At the very end of the corridor, freshly mounted and still slightly tilted to the left, was a portrait he had never seen before. A woman, a medical coat the color of seafoam, brown eyes that held warmth and intelligence in equal measure, a smile that was both professional and deeply, unmistakably human, the kind of smile that made patients feel like they were going to be okay even before the doctor said a word. Her name was printed at the bottom of the frame in polished gold lettering: Dr. Amanda Roberts, Chief Medical Advisor, Hargrove Medical Group. Marcus stood completely still. His mop handle slipped slightly in his grip. The hallway felt suddenly different, smaller, closer, like the walls had taken one quiet step inward. He knew that face, not from a magazine, not from a company newsletter, not from anywhere professional or distant or explainable. He knew that face the way you know the face of the person who used to sleep beside you, the way you know a smile that once made you feel like the luckiest man alive, the way you know eyes that you've spent years trying to forget and failed every single time. He knew that face better than his own reflection. His hands were trembling when he reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. Tucked behind his ID, behind Lily's most recent school photo, was a picture he'd carried for 8 years, creased down the middle, colors slightly faded at the edges, a little worn at the corners from being handled too many times in too many dark moments. He held it up next to the portrait. Same eyes, same smile, same slight dimple on the left cheek that only appeared when the smile was completely real. "Sarah," he whispered. The word fell out of him like something he'd been holding underwater. He didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table of his small apartment in Pilsen with a cup of coffee that went cold, and that photo flat on the table in front of him, and he just sat there while the clock moved and the city outside made its quiet nighttime sounds. Down the hall, his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, slept with her nightlight on and her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, completely unaware that her father's entire world had just tilted on its axis. Sarah Webb had been his wife, his partner, his best friend since they were 24 years old, and met at a mutual friend's cookout in Wicker Park. They'd gotten married young, had Lily young, and been happy, genuinely, simply, completely happy in the way that people sometimes are before life decides to complicate things. And then one Tuesday morning 5 years ago, Sarah had kissed Lily on the forehead while she slept, set her wedding ring on the kitchen counter, and walked out the front door. No note, no explanation, no goodbye. The police had called it a voluntary disappearance. No signs of foul play, no evidence of coercion. She'd simply chosen to leave, they said. With the tone of people who had seen this before and found it unremarkable, Marcus had hired a private investigator for 8 months. He'd called every hospital, every relative, every friend. He'd filed reports and followed leads and driven to 3 different cities based on tips that went nowhere. After 2 years, he stopped. Not because he stopped caring, but because the grief was slowly swallowing him alive. And he still had a 2-year-old daughter who needed her father to be present, to be whole, or at least to pretend to be. He'd told Lily that Mommy had to go away, that it wasn't her fault, that some things were too hard to explain when you're small, but that she was loved. Absolutely. Completely loved, even by the people who weren't there. He'd been saying that so long he almost believed it covered everything. Now Sarah was a board-level executive at one of the most powerful medical corporations in the Midwest, under a different name, with a medical degree and a framed portrait and a title in gold letters, and Marcus had been mopping her hallway for 3 years without knowing it. The next morning, Marcus did something he had never done in 3 years of employment. He asked building management for a meeting. He told them it was about a scheduling conflict with the cleaning, rotation, simple, routine, forgettable. What he actually wanted was one name. By noon he had it. Richard Hargrove, founder, chairman, CEO, the man whose name was on the building, on the letterhead, on the plaques in the lobby. A man worth, according to a quick internet search, somewhere in the neighborhood of $400 million. By 2 p.m., Marcus Webb was standing outside the executive suite on the 42nd floor in his burgundy work uniform, holding a clipboard he didn't need, asking a very polished assistant for 5 minutes of the most powerful man in the building's time. The assistant looked at him the way people sometimes look at a janitor who's wandered slightly out of his designated area, not unkind, but uncertain. Mr. Hargrove's schedule is completely full today, sir. If you'd like to leave a message, tell him it's about the new portrait in the executive hallway, Marcus said. His voice was steady. He was surprised by how steady it was. Tell him the janitor has a question about the woman in it. The assistant paused. Something shifted slightly in his expression, a flicker of something he couldn't quite categorize. He picked up the phone. 30 seconds later, he looked back at Marcus with barely concealed surprise. He'll see you now. Richard Hargrove was 63 years old with silver, hair cut close and the kind of steady, unhurried gaze that came from decades of sitting across tables from people who wanted things from him. He was not an unkind-looking man, but he was a careful one. He studied Marcus from across his enormous desk for a long moment before he spoke. You wanted to ask about the portrait? The woman in it, Marcus said. Dr. Amanda Roberts. I know her, but not by that name. Silence moved through the room like weather. What name do you know her by? Richard asked. His voice was completely controlled, but something behind his eyes had shifted. Sarah Webb, Marcus said. She was my wife. He watched Richard Hargrove absorb that, watched him close his eyes briefly, not in denial, but in something that looked almost like relief, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and had just been given permission to set it down. Sit down, Marcus, Richard said quietly. Marcus sat. The story Richard told was not the one Marcus had spent 5 years constructing in his head. Sarah had not left because she stopped loving him. She had not left for another man, or because she was unhappy, or because she'd decided the life they built together wasn't enough. She had left because she was sick, gravely, frighteningly sick. A rare autoimmune condition, aggressive, progressive, and at the time of diagnosis not well understood. Her doctors had been honest with her, in the way doctors sometimes are, when they've run out of optimistic things to say. She had been 29 years old with a 2-year-old daughter and a husband she adored, and a diagnosis that told her she was running out of time. And in her terror, she had made a decision, a devastating, misguided, heartbroken decision that she believed was the most selfless thing she could do. Disappear before Lily was old enough to remember her, before Marcus spent his best years watching her decline, before the people she loved most were destroyed by watching her go slowly instead of all at once. She had been wrong. She knew that now. She had known it for years. Richard Hargrove was her mother's older brother, estranged from the family for over a decade. Due to an old dispute that had never fully healed, he had found Sarah collapsed on a bench at a bus station in Indianapolis, 3 months after she left Chicago. Alone, sick, with almost nothing. He had gotten her treatment. He had funded an experimental protocol through the research division of his own company. He had sat with her through the worst of it, and when she asked him, in a moment of shame so deep she could barely speak, if she could have a fresh start, a new name, a new path, a chance to build something from the wreckage she'd made of herself, he had said yes. He had never stopped feeling guilty about that yes. She talks about Lily, Richard said, his voice quieter now. Not often, but sometimes when she doesn't think anyone is paying attention, I catch her looking at photos of children around that age. She asks me occasionally if I have any way of knowing how your family is doing. He paused, looked at Marcus directly. I told her I didn't know where you were. I told her the truth. I had no idea. I didn't know the name Webb meant anything to me until 30 minutes ago. The room was very quiet. Is she healthy? Marcus asked. Is she okay? She's been in full remission for 2 years, Richard said. She finished her medical degree 4 years ago. She's one of the best physicians I've ever had the privilege of knowing. He stopped, then added more softly. She's also one of the loneliest people I've ever known. Marcus drove to the address in Evanston on a Thursday afternoon, a quiet residential street near the lake. Mature trees, a small house with blue shutters and a front garden that someone tended with real care. Herbs in clay pots, a climbing rose trained along the fence, a wind chime near the door that spun slowly in the October breeze. He sat in his car for 11 minutes. He counted. Then he got out and knocked. The door opened. Sarah stood there in a gray sweater and dark jeans. Her hair shorter than he remembered. A few faint lines near her eyes that hadn't been there before. She looked like herself and also like someone who had lived through something enormous and come out the other side. Changed in ways that didn't fully have words yet. She saw him and the color left her face completely. Marcus. Hi, he said. Just that, just hi. Because there were 1,000 things to say and none of them were ready yet. And sometimes the only honest word available is the smallest one. She started crying before he finished the word. The kind of crying that isn't pretty or composed. The kind that comes from somewhere so deep and so long held that when it finally surfaces, it surfaces all at once. He didn't move to hug her. Not yet, this wasn't that moment. This was the moment before that moment. The one where two people stand at the edge of something vast and try to find their footing. They sat on her front porch for nearly 4 hours. They said hard things, then harder things, then the hardest things of all. Marcus told her what the first year had been like. The silence. The questions Lily started asking at 4 that he didn't have answers for. The way he'd learned to cook because there was nobody else. The way he'd stayed awake some nights convinced that he'd done something wrong. Said something wrong, been somehow not enough, before he finally, painfully, made peace with the fact that he might never know the reason. Sarah told him what it felt like to make that decision at 29. How certain she'd been that it was the right thing. How slowly and completely that certainty had dissolved into something she could only describe as a private shame she carried every single day. How remission hadn't felt like victory. It had felt like evidence of the magnitude of her mistake. They both cried, more than once, without apology. But at the very end, as the sun dropped behind the rooftops and the lake breeze turned, cold enough that their breath was just barely visible, Marcus took out his phone and opened his photos. Lily, last birthday, 7 candles, frosting on her nose, laughing, really laughing, at something just off camera, head thrown back, completely uninhibited in the way that children laugh when they feel perfectly safe. He held the phone out to Sarah without saying anything. She took it with both hands, looked at the photo for a long time. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes filled again. She has your laugh, she finally said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She has your eyes, Marcus replied. The road forward was not simple. It was not a switch that flipped or a wound that closed cleanly overnight. There were more conversations. There were hard ones involving a family therapist, and even harder ones involving a 7-year-old girl who asked questions with the quiet precision that children sometimes have when they sense the adults around them are finally ready to tell the truth. But it was a road, and they were on it. Richard Hargrove, for his part, quietly established a scholarship fund for the children of essential and custodial workers at Hargrove Medical Group the following month. He made no announcement. He sent no press release. He simply mailed a letter. Marcus found it on a Tuesday evening after his shift, when he came home to find Lily asleep on the couch with a library book still open across her chest and the TV turned to something. She'd fallen asleep watching. He sat down beside her, read the letter twice, set it on the coffee table. Then he looked at the photo on the wall, the creased, faded photo that had lived in his wallet for 8 years and now lived in a frame above the bookshelf where it belonged. And he let himself feel, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something that wasn't grief or endurance or quiet determined survival. He let himself feel like maybe the hardest part was behind them, like maybe the story wasn't ending, like maybe, finally after everything, it was just beginning.